This is Dr. Cooley and I would like to welcome you to Lecture 3 on the topic of Agronomy and Climate. This lecture is the third lecture of the subject Agronomy 1, which is part of the Bachelor of Agriculture and Technology and the Bachelor of Equine Studies. The Bachelor of Agriculture and Technologies is a degree offered by a partnership between Melbourne Polytechnic and La Trobe University, while the Bachelor of Equine Studies is offered at Melbourne Polytechnic. Please visit our website at www.melbournepolytechnic.edu.au for information about this course and other courses that we offer. In today's lecture, I'm going to introduce the subject of agronomy. We're going to outline the basic inputs for plant growth and talk extensively about one of those important inputs, the role of Australian climate on Australian agronomy. They cannot move their bodies, they are static, therefore they cannot hide, and they cannot protect themselves by hiding. They are exposed to the climate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the moment they germinate to the moment they become denatured or die. Plants are living organs, and as such they are reliant on biological processes for growth and survival. These biological processes are exposed to the climate and are impacted by all aspects of the climate. Climate has significant effects on plant growth. In the next part of this lecture we will explore the science of climate. The difference between climate and weather is a measure of time. This is defined by NASA. Weather is what conditions of the atmosphere are over a short period of time, and climate is how the atmosphere behaves over relatively long periods of time. When we talk about climate change, we talk about changes in long-term averages of daily weather. How many times have you heard from a parent, a grandparent, a friend, or a neighbour? That weather was different when we were at school, or something of that ilk. Like when I first moved to Australia, I remember hearing stories of how weather was different from the older population, particularly the rainfall patterns. Well, this change suggests a change in or evolving of a climate. The differences are important when growing plants, as plants respond both to short-term growing conditions, for example a hot spell, and to long-term growing conditions, the effect of growth and development, and these are accumulative inputs. Let us now spend some time becoming familiar with the climate data as presented in this lecture. We will look at temperature, max, means, minimums and distributions, frost, snow, rainfall, total annual distribution intensity, humidity, hail, wind, average speed, gust, direction and duration, as well as sunlight hours and cloudiness. Start looking at temperature. The first thing to note about temperature is it's not static, it changes throughout the day. Therefore, which temperature data do you select? What's relevant to you as a plant? You can easily calculate the mean temperature over a 24-hour period, and maximum, that's the hottest, and minimums, the coolest, during these periods. All of these are used in plant physiology, as they can impact the plants in different ways. The following map is the Australian daily maximum temperature distribution. Please note, this source is from the Bureau of Meteorology. You can review this source at www.bom.gov.au. A number of things are important to note in this graph. Firstly, the scale is degrees C. Secondly, is the colour responds to the temperature. The Bureau of Meteorology have used a common sense scale. That is, orange represents hot colours, while clear and blues represent cooler colours. It is difficult to see from this slide but the scale ranges from above 30 degrees to below -4 degrees. One of the things that you will note is that the colour is not the same in all areas of Australia. There are what we call regional effects of temperature. You can see up at the north tip of Australia, it is warmer than the cooler parts, the lower parts or the south of Australia, with Tasmania being quite cool. You will also note that there are lines on the graph. These lines help to define regions, but based on the temperature patterns, not on whether they are a state or not. The following map shows the Australian daily average temperature distribution. Again, the key is in degrees C, and again the warmer colours represent warmer temperatures, while the clear and blue represent cooler temperatures. The lines are also defined by the average temperature regions. You will note again that the average temperature is not the same all over Australia. It is very regional based, with North Australia being warm and South Australia being cool. The following map shows the Australian daily average temperature distribution. Again, the key is in degrees C, and again the warmer colours represent warmer temperatures, while the clear and blue represent cooler temperatures. The lines are also defined by the average temperature regions. You will note again that the average temperature is not the same all over Australia. It is very regional based, with North Australia being warm and South Australia being cool. The temperature map I'm going to show you is of the Australian daily minimum temperature distribution. Again, this map was supplied by the Bureau of Meteorology from www.bom.gov.au. Again, you will note that there are different areas of temperature. Even with the minimum or coolest temperatures of an area, the north is still warmer than the south. Few observations that can be made from looking at the max, minimum and average temperature data from the Bureau of Meteorology. There is a large variation of temperature regardless of how you measure the temperature parameter. The north of Australia has the hottest temperatures. The average, the max and the min are all hotter than other areas in Australia. The central regions of Australia are also hot. The largest part of Australia is desert or semi-arid. Areas where commercial agronomy is not typically practiced. The southeast and southwest corners have a temperate climate and moderately fertile soil. The northern part of the country has a tropical climate, varied between tropical rainforest, grasslands and part desert. The unit of temperature in both the science of agronomy and by the Bureau of Meteorology is recorded in degrees C. The Bureau of Meteorology is an excellent resource for agronomy and one I would encourage you to become familiar with. The temperature distribution of Australia restricts the growing area of commercial crops. The temperature variation between the minimum and the maximum is considerable, adding to growing difficulties. The temperature can be very hot, and this does have a negative impact on some plant growth. You can think of optimal ambient growing temperature as ideal temperatures. The optimal temperature will not inhibit any aspect of growth and development. All plants have an optimum ambient growing temperature. There are a group of plants called temperate crops. These plants have evolved in temperate regions on the planet and are called temperate crops. The optimal growing temperature for many temperate crops is 25 degrees C. Temperate crop temperature is obtained through strict controlled experimentation. When ambient temperature significantly deviates from the optimal growing temperature, the corresponding impacts will depend on both the direction of response, that is, how hot or cold it is, and the magnitude of the response, how many degrees above or below the ideal temperature is. To determine this optimal temperature, temperature response curves are produced using controlled environmental experimentation. On your slide handout, there is a link to a reading improved understanding of temperature thresholds used in crop models. You can refer to this for more information if you wish. So, let us have a look at a typical temperature response curve. The figure on your screen shows the temperature response curve for a maize crop. On the y-axis is the relative rates of growth, and on the x-axis is the temperature. And you will see the temperature in this experimentation ranges from 0 to about 41 degrees. This top temperature is often referred to as temperature max, or for short, Tmax. The symbols on the graph, which range from circles, open triangles and closed triangles, and crosses, represent a suite of scientific peer-reviewed experimentation. The results from these experiments have been plotted, and the line that follows these experiments has been mathematically determined based on modelling. This can show you that the curve or response is similar but not exactly a bell shape. In fact, it's slightly skewed to the right. Please note, when conducting these experiments, all other inputs were not limiting. That means that things like water and nutrients, carbon dioxide, were not limited. It also means that the assumption is that the crop is healthy and not suffering from any disease or insect attacks. This is described as the reductionist approach, meaning that you are only changing one parameter at any one given time. These are fundamental principles that the scientific research stands upon. This particular response curve for maize is demonstrating that the optimal temperature for growing this variety of maize is at 31 degrees C. T-opt is the abbreviation for optimal temperature. This number was determined as it is represented on the graph as the top of the graph. If you move to the left-hand side, you will see that the response is different to the right-hand side, i.e., if you go hotter than the optimal temperature, the response is different than if you go cooler from the optimal temperature. For your information, I have added the optimal temperature point on the graph and shown that if the graph was to move to the left, the temperature response curve would show a cooler response, and if it was moved to the right, it would show a hotter response. Plants will respond to both mean temperature and temperature variability. For the evolution of the effect of high temperature on yield, not only is the maximum temperature important, but also the planting date can influence the developmental stage of the crop when high temperatures occur. If flowering, for example, moves by several weeks, it could be placed in temperatures that are extremely sensitive. For example, in Australia, if you plant crops too late, flowering can incur high temperatures. Crop models can be used to predict this. In summary, temperature can increase or decrease yield, and it depends on the optimal versus the ambient temperature relationship. It is different for each crop, variety and area. Australia's climate is ruled by the hot, sinking air of the subtropical high-pressure belt, which moves north and south within seasons. This causes the rainfall pattern over Australia to be highly seasonal. Australia's rainfall is the lowest of the 7 continents, besides Antarctica. Rainfall is variable, with frequent droughts lasting several seasons, and is thought to be caused in part by the El Niño Southern Oscillation. Since it is a small continent separated from polar regions by the Southern Ocean, Australia does not get the harsh snaps of the polar air that swarm over Northern Hemisphere continents during winter. The continents in the Northern Hemisphere have a considerable temperature contrast between summer and winter, whereas in Australia the temperature contrast is small. We have talked about the variation in rain and the variation in temperature across Australia. This leads into the concept of seasonality. Seasonality is really the amalgamation of all of those aspects which create a climate and their cyclic fluctuations which occur during the year. In some areas of Australia, the Aboriginals had 6 seasons. These were the wet, the dry season, summer, autumn, winter and spring. The Bureau of Meteorology has characterised major seasonal rainfall zones for Australia. You can see that many different types of zones exist. That is, from a temperate climate through to a more marked hotter and drier climate. Each colour represents a different climate class, and these classes are defined on the right-hand side of the image. This figure on the slide, also produced by the Australian Government Bureau of Meteorology, defines the climatic classes by rainfall in millimetres. Again, the colours associated with the amount of rainfall these areas on average receive. You will notice from the variation in colour, again, that Australia is subjected to great seasonal rainfall. The image on the slide, produced by the Bureau of Meteorology, demonstrates the days of rain per annum, on average for Australia. As you can see, there are large variations, ranging from no rain all the way through to 175 days of rain. And finally, for your reference, I have included a slide on rainfall deciles. The graph on your screen now illustrates the rainfall distribution across a year for 4 major cities: Hobart, Darwin, Melbourne and Perth. You will note that Melbourne and Hobart have reasonably steady rainfall throughout the year. Darwin in the far north has a lot of rainfall from November to March, followed by a very dry period from May to September, while Perth follows a different pattern again. This figure shows great variation in rainfall distribution across Australia. If rainfall in a particular area is above an optimum, It is not the amount of rain that is important, but many farmers will argue the reliability of that rain. This is an important agronomical input and therefore consideration when choosing an area to grow a crop and the type of crop that should be planted. The index of variability is a mathematical relationship which allows an assessment of rainfall and its reliability. The lower the value, the more reliable the rainfall. The index of variability is equal to the 90th percentile rainfall minus the 10th percentile rainfall divided by the 50th percentile rainfall values for a given area over a given time. The following table contains data from the Bureau of Meteorology based at Seymour, a farming town that is a 1-hour drive north of Melbourne off the Hume Highway. The annual percentile analysis table was compiled by the Bureau of Meteorology for Seymour. This data can be requested from this department and will be emailed to you as a spreadsheet, and looks like the spreadsheet on the screen. Let us calculate the index of variability for Seymour. Please note that the median rainfall statistic represents the 50 percentile rainfall. To calculate the index of variability for Seymour, you will need to consider a few facts. Use the formula on the screen. Index of variability equals 90th percentile minus 10th percentile. You take that value and then divide it by the 50th percentile. Secondly, we use the annual data points provided and not the monthly data for this calculation. Thirdly, select the data points that you need to calculate the index. You can stop the lecture now and consider which points these might be. Please bring your calculated value to the first practical, that is the first day of teaching at Yang Ying, so we can discuss this value. If a crop is limited in the amount of water that is available, it is defined as water stressed. This may also be described as drought stress. If a crop has too much water, this can result on negative impacts on yield. The excessive amount of water can cause anaerobic conditions in the soil, or too much water can wash away nutrients and soil structure. If a crop does not have access to the correct volume of water it needs, its growth and productivity will be negatively impacted. The data on the screen was obtained by the FAO Irrigation and Drainage Paper 66, Crop Yield Responses to Water. While it may look very complicated, the take-home message is relatively simple, that different growth stages require different amounts of water. And if you impact on different growth stages, you'll have different impacts on yield. So that means depending on what stage of the life cycle a crop is at, it will depend on the impact of the water deficit. The figure on the slide demonstrates this. Each line represents a linear water production function. That is, it describes the relationship of water deficit as a different key developmental period. The slope represents mathematical relationships. The mathematical relationship suggests that the response to water is a linear one. You need to understand that the steeper the slope, the greater the reduction to yield. Once you understand the relationship between the steepness of the slope, you will understand the take-home messages of this slide. In summary, flowering is very sensitive while ripening is not as sensitive. If you wish to, you can make a list starting from least sensitive to most sensitive based on the figure on this slide. If you have ever lived in a cold place on the planet, you will be aware what a cold, frosty morning feels like. Frost damage symptoms can severely impact plants. Their mode of action is that ice can form inside the plant tissue and then expand, resulting in mechanical damage. You may also get dehydration injury, which results in physical damage. Frost can damage and reduce grain yields and quality. In 2008, extreme frosts in September in WA, Western Australia that is, were estimated to cost $105 million from the potential net farm income for that year. In Australia, frost tends to occur in the cooler areas, that is north, and particularly in areas like Tasmania. The costs associated with frost are in conservation management, that is, they try and minimise frost risk. These include delayed sowing and its associated yield reduction, sowing less profitable crops such as barley and oats, avoiding cropping on the valley floors, which are also contain some of the most productive parts of the landscape. Different conditions under which the frost occurs will influence what management practices will be more effective. These also include delay flowering, avoid high inputs, sow more frost to tolerant crops and pastures, grow hay, avoid sowing susceptible crops in frost prone areas such as low-lying areas, sow and graze dual-purpose crops, encourage cool air drainage. This requires a specialised consultant. Clay sandy surface paddocks. Ensure crops have an adequate supply of trace elements and macronutrients. Crop deficient or marginal in potassium and copper are more likely to be susceptible to frost damage, and this may also be the cause for molybdenum, another micronutrient. If your crop experienced a frost event, there are a number of strategies after the frost event that you can implement. These are known collectively as post-frost management. You can harvest as usual and just wear the reduction in the yield. Hay and silage. You can chain and rake. You can graze, spray, cultivate, swathe and burn. You will be given a tutorial to accompany this lecture called Frost and Crops. In this tutorial you will be given an exercise about the subtopic of frost and agronomy. Please note that the information that you gain from this tutorial will complete these lecture notes. So when both you are revising for this lecture and compiling your lecture notes, please ensure that you insert your frost and crops tutorial information in this section here. Evaporation is the amount of water which evaporates from an open pan called a Class A evaporative pan. The rate of evaporation depends on factors such as cloudiness, air temperature and wind speed. Measurements are made by the addition or subtraction of a known amount of water, which then tells us how much water has been evaporated from the pan. The figure on the slide from the FAO Chapter 3 Crop Water Needs summarises this relationship. Average pan evaporation has been calculated by the Bureau of Meteorology for Australia. Different colours relate to different total evaporation. The unit recorded is in millimetres. As you can see from the colour variation, there is considerable change or variation in pan evaporation across Australia. This is another climate input that needs to be considered when growing crops, as it has physiological effects on both crop growth and productivity. The lowest pan evaporation occurs around the south and southeast, while the centre and the northeast have higher total pan evaporation. Next time you're stood outside on a windy day, you may take a few minutes to realise how difficult it is to measure wind direction, as it is often changing. The difficulties in this measurement are also reflected in the difficulties of representing this kind of data. The windrows is a time-honoured method of graphically presenting the wind conditions, the wind direction and speed over a period of time at specific locations. Again, the Bureau of Meteorology have produced maps that illustrate differences. We will look at a map both in the morning and in the afternoon. Wind can impact crops in two major ways. It can change the leaf boundary layer environment, which has an impact on transpiration, the loss of water through plants, pores called stomate. It can influence water loss. Secondly, wind can result in damage to crop growth, reduce cell division and cell elongation. This can reduce plant height and leaf area, and some instances can completely destroy your crop. You will see from examining the windroses across different areas of Australia that there is much variation in this climate input. The image on the slide now illustrates afternoon wind in the summer months. You can pause the lecture here and see if you can identify which areas in Australia have different morning and afternoon wind observations. You should also be able to identify areas with relatively high winds and areas where wind is not such a consideration. Depending on where your farm or your farming enterprise is based, you can use the information on this map to select your crops for the most optimal crop yield and production. For example, if you have a crop like wheat, it may be more suited to a temperate environment than an equatorial environment. The number of hours that the sun shines across a day is easily calculated, and the Bureau of Meteorology have produced a map and illustrated differences across Australia. The colours on the map represent the number of hours. The yellow colour is the highest number of hours, while the purple, deep purple colour, not represented on the image but on the key, shows very few hours. You will note that there is some variation in daily sunshine hours across Australia, with the areas around Perth having the most sunshine. Too much light can damage plants via the mechanism called photorespiration. Not enough plants can reduce production and yield. So why is sunshine so important for crop growth? The graph here summarises the relationship between photosynthesis, which we will discuss in detail in Lecture 4, which for the purposes here you can think of as the energy production, to light levels. Light levels are on the x-axis, and the abbreviation for the measurement is ppfd, and this is measured in a unit called micromoles per metre squared per second. In summary, that unit is the amount of energy, the micromoles, over an area, the metre squared, over time, a second. The photosynthetic rate is also commonly in the literature called assimilation rate, and this is also measured in the amount of energy, micromoles, over an area, metre squared, over time per second. This relationship on the graph is stating that as light levels increase, so does assimilation rate. Therefore, the more light, the more growth. This is true most of the time. However, there are some situations where too much light can become a stress, particularly when ambient temperatures are above optimal temperatures, or when the plant is significantly water stressed. When you start to sum some of the climatic data, you can create what is called climate zones. The Bureau of Meteorology has produced a climate zone indicating changes in temperature and humidity for Australia. This is a simple and very significant concept. We can begin to class areas of Australia into these climatic zones and think about how they impact on agronomy. As you can see from the illustration on the slide, the north areas of Australia tend to be hot and humid, while the lower areas, or the more southern areas, particularly down in Hobart, are more temperate and cooler. There are other systems of classification worth noting, and we will explore some of these now. Windermere Peter Koppen was a German scientist who studied in the area of geography, climate, and was also a botanist. He had an interesting career which gave him many of these skill sets. He completed his PhD on the effects of temperature on plant growth at the University of Zurich in 1870. In 1884, he published his first system of climate classification, which can be seen on the slide. The Koppen system of climate classification is based on the concept that native vegetation is the best expression of climate. Hence, climate zones boundaries have been selected with vegetation distribution in mind. It combines average annual and monthly temperatures with annual precipitation and with seasonal precipitation. Here is a later published map based on Koppen's classification and modified on major classification groups. Australia's climate, as you can see, ranges from temperate, which is ideal for growing many C3 crops, through to tropical and equatorial, more suited for some C4 and CAN plants. These plants exhibit specializations to these habitats. The variation in climate that we have discussed previously in this lecture is reflected by the huge variation in native vegetation. Here we can examine Koppen's modified system in more detail. The right-hand axis gives more detail about the different climate classifications and sub-classifications within each classification. The final map that you have seen based on the modified Koppen system is the most recent, published by the Bureau of Meteorology in 2013. You will note more detail and a higher resolution is shown in this image than the previous images. GAO has published an article on crops and climate, and it is a highly recommended article to read to help you understand better the interactions between climate and crops. The HTTP web link can be found on your PowerPoint presentation. At the end of this lecture, you should compile a summary of the most important concepts delivered in the lecture. In this lecture, some of the important concepts I consider important are that you understand that Australia has a varied climate, and this includes all components of that climate, from temperature, humidity, light, wind and frost. This climate is described very accurately by the Bureau of Meteorology, and throughout this lecture you have seen maps which enable you to describe all of these climate inputs. These climate inputs can impact both positively and negatively on growth and crop development of plants. It is important that you understand the concept of seasonality, particularly as the Australian climate and environment is very susceptible to seasonality. This can have significant impacts in agronomy and agronomy management. Index of variability is a concept that we have dealt with and is a measure of rainfall reliability. Any deviation from the optimal climate inputs, either temperature, water availability, sunlight, wind and humidity, can result in reduced yield and quality. The timing, that is the duration, intensity and frequency and phenological stage of the climatic stress, can result in different effects. And you've been shown examples how different stresses on different phenological stages can impact. And finally, climate maps have been developed based on native vegetation, which are a very good source in order to estimate what crops would be best to grow in your region and what crops to stay away from. There are many considerations with respect to climate, and it is important that you familiarise yourself with climate, with the measurement of climate, with its inputs, and how it affects both your commodity and your physiology of your crop. This is the end of Lecture 2.